that he wasn't very happy about when it came to getting that spiritual release.
Okay.
All right, let's talk about it afterwards.
Friends, imagine this. Secrets so dark that they don't just break trust. They cost more than $2 million in silence, lies, and betrayal. The Brown family wasn't only torn apart by jealousy and broken vows, but by hidden deals, secret commitments, and a daughter left in the shadows. And if what's about to be revealed is true, then Kody Brown's entire empire of sister wives was built on a truth far more expensive than anyone ever imagined. Friends, it's me, Meri, and I welcome you warmly to Starspill USA, where today we embark upon what may be the longest and most revealing narrative I have ever shared with you. A narrative crafted in the flow of British English and spun not in fragments, but in one continuous outpouring of words, weaving together emotion, history, betrayal, whispers, and courtroom-like revelations until it becomes not simply an account of sister wives, but an epic of secrecy and exposure. So prepare yourself, because this is going to be immense. Imagine the Browns, the family you thought you knew, a family placed under a microscope by reality television, its members laid bare for the world to see, every smile, every tear, every confession taped and broadcast to millions, yet within that, highly public existence. Another story lived and breathed, one so well concealed that even the most loyal of fans only caught glimpses in fleeting inconsistencies, gaps in schedules, silences that were never explained, and now we peel back those layers. For years, viewers have watched Christine struggle with the ache of feeling unseen, her laughter laced with pain as she fought for the scraps of affection that Kody chose to distribute. And Meri, once the legal wife, relegated to the shadows of memory, pushing forward with forced smiles that failed to hide her gnawing loneliness. Janelle, with her calm rationality, constantly firefighting the chaos of emotions, standing as the pragmatic voice, though she herself carried 1,000 unanswered questions. And Robyn, whose tears flowed freely, who seemed at once the closest to Kody and yet at times the most conflicted, her role as peacemaker leaving her with more knowledge than she ever disclosed. But through it all stood Kody, the man at the center, declaring himself a patriarch of vision, a spiritual leader, a figure destined to show the world that plural marriage was not a strange relic, but a divine calling. And yet, my dear friends, the cruel twist in the tale is that the same man who preached unity may have been living an entirely separate life, concealed from the cameras, hidden even from the women who sacrificed their hearts for him. And this secret was not trivial. It was monumental, for it whispered of another wife, a woman spiritually bound to Kody in a marriage that never appeared on official records, never captured in the storyline, a woman who existed in the shadows, silenced, invisible, and alongside her a child, a daughter who grew up with his blood but not his acknowledgement, a daughter who represents perhaps the deepest betrayal of all, because how does one reconcile the image of a father celebrated for his devotion to family with the reality of a man who kept part of his own flesh and blood outside the circle of love? Think of it. Christine begging for attention, Meri pleading for intimacy, Janelle balancing her children's needs against constant tension, Robyn holding tears in her throat, and all the while another life, another home, another heart beating somewhere beyond their knowledge. What makes this unbearable is that the clues were always there, if only one listened closely enough. The days when Kody disappeared with vague explanations, the rehearsed tone in his voice as he offered excuses about work or errands, the subtle panic in his eyes when fans questioned him about where he had been, the very air heavy with something unsaid. Christine would later admit that she often wondered why his trips stretched longer than expected, why he looked distant when he returned. Meri kept long nights waiting for a call that never came, her chest tight with unspoken dread, Janelle noticed. The children's questions shifting, their voices tinged with confusion when they asked why their father had missed another recital or failed to call back. And Robyn, she seemed always to sense more than she confessed, perhaps out of fear, perhaps because to say it aloud would splinter what little stability remained. But the world beyond the family began to murmur too, whispers among fans who noticed oddities. A blurred photo posted online of Kody in a place he was not meant to be, a tweet about a sighting with an unfamiliar woman, fragments that alone seemed harmless but together formed a pattern too sharp to ignore. And then the speculation deepened, that there had been a spiritual marriage, never legalized, never documented for the show, but binding in its own sphere. And for the woman at the center of it, there was no doubt it was real. She bore the silence. She endured the loneliness, She clutched promises that crumbled into dust. She received sporadic money that spoke of obligation, but not of love. And the greatest evidence of all was not in her words, but in the existence of the child, the daughter who knew her father's face from screens yet rarely from reality, who watched him celebrated as a paragon of family values while she herself remained outside his embrace. Can you imagine the pain of such a child? Of carrying the name in blood but not in voice? Of hearing others praise a man as father and protector while knowing in your heart that he had never fully claimed you? This is no longer mere gossip, my friends, it is a living wound. And if it is true, then the very foundation of what fans believed about Kody Brown collapses like a fragile house of cards. Picture the scene in the Brown household on an ordinary morning, the smell of coffee in the air, the bustle of children. Kody moving between rooms with that performative energy of a man managing a large family. And yet behind his smile, an unmistakable shadow. Christine watching him from the doorway, sensing the burden in his eyes. Meri mapping the frequency of his disappearances with quiet dread. Janelle catching the unease in her children's voices. Robyn piecing together the subtext, but keeping her silence. And through it all, the wives feeling the beat of a secret pressing against the fragile walls of their home. What emerges is not just a scandal, but a looming courtroom drama of the soul. For every secret eventually demands its testimony. And in this case, the testimonies will come as accusations, tears, denials. Bitter words spoken under the weight of truth, the wives asking how long they had been deceived, the child standing as the most undeniable evidence of all. Kody Brown built his persona upon family, upon sacrifice and plural unity. But if these whispers are validated, then his empire was not built upon devotion but upon concealment. And that is a truth which not even his most loyal supporters may forgive. The question is not simply whether Kody crossed a line, but whether he crossed the one line that destroys everything, the abandonment of one's own blood, and here lies the heart of the matter, my friends. Because when a man who claims to represent faith, unity, and family cannot honor the life he has secretly created, what remains of his credibility? What remains of his character? So we move forward into this saga with open eyes, knowing that by the end of it, you may never view Kody Brown in the same light again. And I ask you now, as you listen to this tale unfurl, if these rumors prove true, do you believe he deserves forgiveness? Or is this the moment when even his most ardent supporters must turn away? Keep that question with you, for your answer will shape how this story is remembered. And as we proceed deeper into the hidden chambers of the Brown family's truth, the story only grows darker, more intricate, more shattering, until silence is no longer possible, and the full weight of revelation falls upon every life entangled in this family's name. The hushed conversation that had begun with restrained murmurs soon swelled into something heavier, a current of sound that carried with it the sharpness of withheld truths and the menace of long-buried secrets rising to the surface. And as Christine lingered by the corridor, heart pounding in her chest, she could almost taste the tension in the air, each muffled syllable hitting her ears like fragments of glass, cutting into the fragile picture of family life she had worked so hard to preserve, and yet she could not walk away. For instinct told her that this was the night the veil would finally lift. The night the questions that had haunted her for years would at last bleed into answers she might not want to hear. Answers that could cost more than peace. Perhaps even the family's very survival. Because secrets of this nature were never free. They came with a price, and whispers in certain corners hinted that this one was worth nearly $2 million. Money so significant that it could not be ignored. Money that might have been hidden, diverted, or stolen. Money that, if traced, would reveal not only betrayal, but an entire secret life. Meri, in her own room, pressed the heels of her palms against her temples, trying to silence the storm of memories that surged forth unbidden. The missed phone calls, the faint perfume that did not belong to any of them, the unexplained trips that had been waved away with dismissive excuses, all of it once brushed aside for the sake of peace, all of it now rushing back with an intensity that left her trembling, the hot tears in her eyes a mixture of rage and despair. For she could no longer deny that the man she had trusted had been playing a game of shadows, a game where she was nothing more than a pawn, and what terrified her most was not simply the betrayal of love, but the possibility that for years her loyalty had been funding something far darker, a family hidden in the shadows, another woman, another child, another world existing alongside hers, feeding off the sacrifices she had made in silence. Janelle's composure cracked as she moved restlessly from one end of her room to the other, her practical mind trying to assemble a puzzle that made no sense. A puzzle in which Kody's absences, his distant stares, his sudden fits of secrecy, and the family's endless financial troubles might all fit together. The image forming a darker truth that she had long suspected but never dared to name, and she thought of the bank withdrawals, the missing receipts, the vague explanations about business ventures that never materialized. What if those missing dollars, the very ones she had stretched her household budget to cover, were not missing at all, but deliberately funneled elsewhere, into another home? Another set of responsibilities that had nothing to do with the wives and children who bore his name publicly. What if the fortune they had all struggled for had been used to protect the secret he cherished most? And in the room across the hall, Robyn, the wife most often seen as Kody's confidant, felt her own body betray her, the trembling in her hands impossible to still, as she pressed them against the wall and tried to catch fragments of the voice that spoke with such certainty, such familiarity, a voice that belonged not to a stranger but to someone bound to Kody by a past he had buried, a past now clawing its way back into the light. And though she had always prided herself on loyalty and obedience, she could not deny the gnawing fear in her stomach that whispered she had known. Perhaps not the full truth, but pieces of it. The subtle warnings, the way Kody's eyes darkened when certain topics arose, the way he redirected conversations. With practiced ease, all of it now flooding back as evidence of complicity she could not disavow. And though the children slept upstairs, innocent and untouched by the weight of adult secrecy, the very walls seemed to thrum with tension, as if the house itself had been a silent witness to lies too long sustained, and even the creak of a stair, or the whisper of wind at the window seemed like part of a larger confession that no one dared yet to articulate. And it was in these ordinary sounds that Christine heard the hook of a story too vast to ignore. What if the visitor carried documents, proof, records that showed where the money had gone, that tied Kody to a woman whose name none of them had ever heard, and a daughter whose existence, if proven, would obliterate the image he had so carefully crafted before the world? Kody, seated in the lounge with his shoulders squared and his jaw clenched, looked every inch the man of control. But to those who knew him best, the wives who had watched his mannerisms for decades, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, the rigidity of his hands, the measured way he inhaled before responding revealed the truth. That this visitor was no ordinary acquaintance, but a living key to the life he had so carefully hidden, the life that if exposed would bring down the house of cards he had built. In front of cameras and the world, and Christine's chest ached with the certainty of it. Meri's heart raced with the dread of confirmation. Janelle's fists curled with unspent fury, and Robyn's eyes darted toward him with a mix of fear and complicity, for if anyone had suspected, if anyone had known fragments of the story before tonight, it had been her. And yet she too seemed shaken by the gravity of what now hovered over them all, and the hours of that night dragged on endlessly, the silence between words screaming louder than the whispers themselves, until the sound of the visitor's footsteps retreating down the walkway left a hollow echo in their ears, an absence that was more terrifying than any presence, for the silence screamed of unfinished revelations, of truths delivered in fragments, that would return in full force. And as dawn crept pale and cold across the windows, each of the wives rose from a night of broken sleep, knowing instinctively that nothing would ever be the same again. That the family whose image had been broadcast to the world as a story of unity and faith was now standing on the precipice of collapse. A collapse not born of petty jealousies or household arguments, but of betrayal so profound that it threatened to rip through everything they had built, leaving only ruins in its wake. And though no words were spoken at breakfast, the heaviness in the air made it impossible to swallow even a sip of coffee. For each of them, in their own hearts, now understood that Kody's secrets had reached the surface at last, and the day ahead would not be a continuation of their old life, but the beginning of a reckoning that would demand every hidden truth be dragged into the light. And here is the hook that lingers above it all, the question that no wife dared to voice aloud, but every heart carried in silence. If Kody had indeed hidden a marriage, a wife, and a child, all while funneling nearly $2 million into their upkeep, what else had he hidden, and how long before the world would come, knocking at their door demanding answers they could no longer suppress? The hours that followed were unlike any other the Brown household had endured. For though the visitor's physical presence had left with the echo of their footsteps on the gravel, their shadow remained etched upon the walls, lingering in every Glance exchanged, every silence that pressed too heavily between breaths, and Christine, unable to quiet her mind, found herself walking the length of the upstairs corridor in the half-light, her bare feet against the creaking wood, a rhythm that matched the racing of her heart, and with every turn she asked herself the same unrelenting question. What if the whispers were true? What if the rumors that Kody had funneled nearly $2 million into another life were not mere gossip but fact? And what if that life included not just a woman but a child who bore his blood yet not his name? The very thought lanced through her like betrayal sharpened to a knife's edge, for she had given years of devotion, endured neglect, smiled through jealousy and loneliness, all for a man who preached unity whilst carving division. And if she had been fighting for scraps of love while another woman lived in silence with Kody's protection, then all of her sacrifices had been for nothing, and her laughter, so often a mask, had merely been the sound of her own heart breaking unnoticed. In her room, Meri sat rigid, her hands still clutching the cooling mug of tea she had forgotten to drink, her eyes fixed on the pale light outside the window yet seeing nothing of it, her mind replaying the fragments of that late-night conversation. The visitor's voice low, deliberate, certain, a voice that carried with it not the air of speculation but the weight of proof. And though she had heard no details, her spirit recognized the truth instinctively, because over the years she had felt the shifts in Kody's presence, the absences that lasted longer than they should, the bank accounts that emptied without explanation, the eyes that looked at her but seemed always to see someone else. And now, with the clarity of hindsight, she realized that the signs had been there all along, but she had lacked the courage to see them. Janelle, ever pragmatic, was less inclined to dwell on the emotional betrayal and more focused on the trail of evidence that must exist. Receipts, transfers, signed checks, hidden accounts, all the things that could not vanish no matter how. Carefully, Kody had tried to obscure them, and though fury coiled within her chest, her mind ticked like a ledger, lining up anomalies she had dismissed in the past, the missing money that had forced her to stretch their finances to breaking point, the sudden insistence that certain bills be paid in cash, the trips justified as business yet returning with nothing to show. And she knew with absolute certainty that if this matter came to court, if this secret child and silent wife sought justice, the financial records would bleed the truth more eloquently than any testimony. Meanwhile, Robyn, who had spent the night trembling with an anxiety she dared not name, found herself staring at Kody with new eyes. For though she had long been cast as his favorite, the one who received the lion's share of his attention, she now wondered whether she had simply been another mask, another distraction from the deeper secret he had fought so hard to protect. And the thought unsettled her more than she could express, because if Kody had lied to Christine, to Meri, to Janelle, perhaps he had lied to her as well, and if his public devotion had been but a shield, then she too was nothing more than a prop in a story of deceit. Downstairs, Kody sat in the lounge as dawn carved shadows across the carpet, his posture one of forced calm, the coffee in his mug untouched, his eyes distant yet alert, for he knew that his wives, though silent, were circling the truth, and he felt the inevitability of reckoning pressing against his chest, because secrets, once carried into the house, rarely left without consequence, and this particular secret had teeth sharp enough to rip his carefully curated image to shreds. And as he sat there, alone yet not alone, he could hear the echo of the visitor's words resounding in his ears, words that reminded him of promises he had made, promises bound in secrecy, promises that had a face, her face, and the small, innocent eyes of a child who bore his surname in blood if not in recognition. And though he had managed for years to compartmentalize his lives, to convince himself that silence was protection, he knew in his bones that the truth was clawing its way upward, unstoppable, merciless. And what terrified him most was not the exposure itself, but the knowledge that once the truth was spoken aloud, he would no longer be master of the narrative. And for a man whose entire power rested on control, that was a fate worse than any scandal. Upstairs, the wives gathered in the kitchen, unspoken agreement pulling them together like iron drawn to magnet. And though none of them uttered the visitor's name, the tension in their voices betrayed that each of them was circling the same conclusion. And it was Christine who finally gave voice to what all of them feared, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "There is something he hasn't told us, something bigger than anything we've faced before," she said, and though the words were measured, they landed with the weight of a hammer, driving cracks deeper into walls already straining under the burden of silence. And Meri's tears slipped silently down her cheeks, Janelle's jaw tightened, and Robyn looked down at the table as though the wood itself could provide refuge. Yet none of them contradicted Christine, for the truth was too obvious, and in that unspoken agreement lay the beginning of their rebellion. Not loud, not fiery, but quiet, determined, unyielding. For each of them knew that what had been revealed in fragments would soon demand to be faced in full, and the hook that remained, the one question circling them all like a vulture above carrion, was simple yet devastating. If Kody had hidden a secret wife and a secret child, and if nearly $2 million had been spent to keep that life alive, then how much longer could he expect them to live in ignorance? And what would happen when the secret itself came knocking, demanding a place not just in their household but in history, in court, and in the eyes of the world? The morning that followed was not a morning at all, but rather the slow bleed of a sleepless night into a gray sky that carried no comfort. Only the weight of inevitability pressing down on every beam and brick of the Brown household. And as Christine stirred in her bed, her eyes rimmed red from hours of staring into darkness, she knew that no amount of distraction, no whispered prayers, no carefully rehearsed smiles could protect them from the storm that had been invited into their lives with that single knock upon the door. For secrets once recognized cannot be unseen, and lies once suspected become a presence louder than truth itself. And as she stepped into the hallway, she saw Meri already there, her hair tied loosely, her face pale, clutching a robe around her body as though it were armor, her eyes locking with Christine's in a moment of wordless recognition. Both of them haunted by the same thought, that everything they had built, endured, sacrificed, had been rendered fragile overnight, and Janelle's heavy footsteps joined them, her composure cracked at last, the practicality that had carried her through years of silent suffering dissolving, as her eyes burned with a fury more protective than personal. For she thought of her children first, the futures they had been denied because funds that could have secured their education. Their opportunities, their stability, had instead been siphoned into an unseen life, a life Kody had chosen to preserve with money and lies, while she had been forced to patch together stability from scraps. And Robyn, entering the hallway last, felt the peculiar torment of knowing that for years she had been accused of being Kody's chosen one, his shield, his confidant, and yet now even she was uncertain whether she had been chosen at all or merely used. And though her lips trembled as she opened them to speak, no words came, only silence thick as smoke. And downstairs Kody sat again, with his cold mug of coffee, his shoulders squared as though ready for battle. But his eyes betrayed him, flickering with the panic of a man who knows that the walls are closing in. And the silence was broken not by his wives, but by the children, their innocent voices cutting through the tension like shards of glass, asking questions they should never have had to ask. Why is Dad so sad? Why is Mom crying? Why is everyone whispering? And the cruelest truth of all was that even the children could sense what the adults had not yet named aloud, that their world had tilted, and nothing would right itself again. By midday, the house felt suffocating, the very air thick with unasked questions, and Christine at last, unable to bear the stillness, spoke to the others in a voice firmer than she expected. "We cannot go on like this. We cannot live under a roof of lies. And if he will not tell us, then we must find the truth ourselves." And her words, once spoken, gave permission to the others to admit what they too felt, that the days of endurance had ended, that the silence had to be broken, and that sooner rather than later, this would no longer be a domestic crisis but a legal one, because money leaves trails, children bear names, and justice is not blind forever. And as if summoned by her declaration, the phone rang, shrill, insistent, slicing through the house. And when Kody answered, his tone was clipped, his words few. But the wives watched him carefully, saw the tightening of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes. And when he returned to the room, his attempt at casualness fooled no one, and though he claimed it had been nothing more than a business call, the truth radiated from him like heat. And the wives, united now by suspicion, prepared themselves, for they knew instinctively that the next knock on the door would not be from a visitor cloaked in silence, but from the law itself. And when that moment came, when truth could no longer be contained, the Brown family would find themselves not merely in the court of public opinion, but in an actual courtroom, where secrets take on the weight of evidence and lies collapse under oath. And as the day drew into dusk, each of them lay awake once more, listening to the hum of a house alive with fear, each breath filled with the echo of the same question. What happens when the man you built your life upon is revealed not as a husband, not even as a father, but as the architect of a deception so vast it can no longer be hidden? And so it began, not with a dramatic outburst or some public collapse, but with the quiet arrival of an envelope, thick, official, its weight heavier than the paper inside could ever account for, slid beneath the Brown family's door, one unsettled morning when the air was still and the children were yet asleep. And as Christine bent to pick it up, her heart seized even before her eyes confirmed what her gut already knew. That this was no ordinary correspondence, no bill, no neighborly note, but a summons, stark in its formality, its language sharp as a blade, calling Kody Brown to answer questions not in the sanctuary of his home, but in the stark exposure of a courtroom, where truth is stripped bare and every silence becomes suspect. And as the wives gathered round, their eyes scanning the lines that spoke of financial irregularities, of undisclosed assets, of a sum whispered to be over $2 million unaccounted for, the reality dawned with crushing clarity. The secrets that had unsettled their nights and poisoned their days were no longer confined within these walls, but had entered the gaze of the law, a place where shadows cannot survive the light. Kody's face, usually so composed in the face of accusation, drained of color. And though he attempted to steady his voice with assurances, the wives were no longer swayed, for they had endured too long, sacrificed too much to be pacified by empty words. And as Meri's trembling hand pointed to the figures written there, her voice cracked, not with weakness, but with decades of suppressed grief. This is our life, Kody, our children's futures, our years, our trust. You buried it all in lies. And Janelle, ever the pragmatic, added with a steeliness that surprised even herself. And now it will all come out, whether you want it to or not. While Robyn, torn between loyalty and fear, pressed her palm against her mouth as though to keep her own secrets from spilling free. For deep down, she, too, wondered how much she had really known, how much she had chosen not to see. And Christine, eyes blazing, though tears threatened to blur her vision, whispered a truth that cut sharper than any blade. You thought you could hide a life, but you cannot hide forever when the law comes, calling. And though the children played in another room, the sound of their laughter only deepened the ache, for they were oblivious to the storm gathering, the storm that would soon drag their father into the harsh light of sworn testimony. Days bled into nights as preparation loomed, documents gathered, lawyers contacted, each conversation with the press a fresh wound, and the house once noisy with the chaos of polygamous life now seemed haunted by silence broken only by the scraping of chairs, the sigh of restless wives, the shuffle of Kody's steps pacing long into the hours before dawn. And when at last the day arrived, the courthouse loomed before them, not as a place of justice, but as a theater of reckoning, its cold, stone steps echoing beneath their feet, each wife arriving with a heart torn between dread and hope. Dread of humiliation, hope for freedom, and as the bailiff called the case, the world that had once celebrated the Browns as a symbol of unconventional family unity now watched hungrily, cameras flashing, whispers swirling, for this was no longer the story of faith and togetherness, but of betrayal, greed, and the unraveling of a man who thought himself untouchable. And as Kody stood before the judge, his jaw clenched, his eyes flickering with the desperation of a cornered animal, the wives seated behind him felt the same pull of inevitability. This was not merely his trial, but theirs as well. For every lie he had told had demanded their silence. Every secret he had hidden had cost them pieces of themselves. And now in this stark chamber, lined with wood and heavy with judgment, all those years of silence stood ready to collapse into a single, devastating truth. That the man who had bound them together in marriage had also bound them in chains of deceit. And the question that hung in the air heavier than any gavel was whether they would emerge still tethered to him, or free at last, though broken.